The house was silent except for the rhythmic ticking of the old wall clock in the hallway. The dim glow from my bedside lamp cast soft shadows across my room, creating an intimate cocoon of solitude. Outside, the rain pattered gently against the window, its sound soothing yet strangely melancholic. It was one of those nights where thoughts wandered freely, sometimes to comforting places and sometimes to dangerous ones. I'd always been careful about my words, my actions, the way I held myself. In a family where tradition weighed heavier than truth, there was little room for anything that didn't fit the mold. And I didn't fit the mold. It wasn't something I ever spoke about. Not to my parents, not to my friends, certainly not to my uncle, who was staying with us for a few weeks. Uncle Ray was the kind of man who commanded a room without saying a word. He had a quiet intensity about him, the kind that made you straighten your back and choose your words carefully. He wasn't harsh, but he was perceptive. He noticed things. That night, I thought I was alone. I thought I was safe, wrapped in my private world of thoughts and feelings I never dared share. The door was closed, and I had let my guard down. But then, a soft creak. I froze. My breath hitched in my throat as I turned toward the door. There, standing in the dim light of the hallway, was Uncle Ray. His sharp eyes locked onto mine, and for a moment, the air between us grew unbearably heavy. I felt exposed, not in a physical sense, but in a way that left me vulnerable, as if he could see straight through me, past the layers of pretense I had carefully built over the years. Seconds stretched into eternity. The silence was suffocating. And then he spoke. The weight of Uncle Ray's stare pinned me to my bed. My pulse pounded in my ears as I scrambled for an explanation, though for what, I wasn't sure. There was nothing explicitly wrong about what I was doing, but in my mind, everything about me felt like a secret that had just been laid bare. "Didn't mean to startle you," he said finally, his deep voice breaking the heavy silence. His hand lingered on the doorframe, as if debating whether to step in or step away. I sat up quickly, my movement stiff. I didn't hear you knock." My voice was uneven, betraying the storm raging inside me. Ray exhaled through his nose, crossing his arms. His posture wasn't aggressive, but there was something unreadable about the way he looked at me. "You were lost in thought," he said, almost like an observation rather than a question. I nodded hesitantly. "Yeah, something like that." He lingered a second longer before stepping inside and closing the door behind him with a soft click. My stomach twisted. "I want to talk to you earlier," he admitted, walking over to my desk and dragging the chair back a little before sitting down. His movements were slow, deliberate, but I get the feeling now might be a better time. I swallowed hard. "About what?" Ray studied me for a moment, tapping his fingers against the arm of the chair. His gaze wasn't judging, but it was piercing, like he saw things I hadn't even realized I was revealing. "About you," he said simply. My chest tightened. "What about me?" He sighed, leaning back. "Look, kid, I'm not here to lecture you. He hesitated, as if weighing his next words carefully. "I see a lot of myself in you." I blinked. Whatever I had expected him to say, that wasn't it. A nervous chuckle escaped me. "That's a first." Ray smirked, shaking his head slightly. "Maybe, but you remind me of someone I used to be." His expression softened, something wistful flickering in his eyes. "Someone who spent a long time hiding." His words sent a shiver down my spine. I knew exactly what he meant, but I couldn't believe he was saying it. I had spent years perfecting the art of keeping my thoughts to myself, of deflecting conversations, of playing along. And yet, here was my uncle, stoic, quiet, distant Uncle Ray, laying something bare between us that I hadn't even spoken aloud to myself. I forced a laugh, but it sounded brittle. "Hiding? I don't know what you mean." Ray's lips pressed into a thin line. "You're a smart kid. Don't play dumb." I flinched at the directness of it. It was like he had reached inside my chest and plucked out the truth before I had the chance to deny it. My walls, the ones I had built so carefully, felt like they were crumbling with every second that passed. My throat was dry. I couldn't find the words. Ray sighed again, rubbing his temple. "Listen, I know what it's like to be young and confused." He paused, glancing at me. I know what it's like to feel like you have to be someone you're not just to keep the peace. But trust me, keeping quiet doesn't make it go away. The weight of his words settled in my chest, suffocating and liberating all at once. I had never talked about this with anyone before. Never. And now, here he was, dragging it into the open like it was just another conversation, like it wasn't the thing that had kept me up at night, twisting in anxiety and self-doubt. You don't know what you're talking about, I whispered, though even I didn't believe it. Ray didn't get angry. He didn't push. He just watched me for a moment before nodding. All right, he said quietly. Then I'll tell you about me. I looked up startled. He ran a hand through his hair, exhaling slowly. When I was your age, I thought I had everything figured out. I was supposed to be this tough guy, football, girls, the whole act. And for a while, I convinced myself that was real. His jaw tightened. Then I met someone who made me realize I wasn't just pretending for everyone else. I was pretending for me. I swallowed, my heart hammering. Ray shook his head, a bitter smile playing on his lips. I was too scared, too proud. I pushed it all away, convinced myself it was just a phase, something I could outgrow. He hesitated, his fingers curling into fists. It wasn't a phase. The room was dead silent. I let that fear control me for years, he admitted, looking at me again. I kept my mouth shut. I played my part. And you know what? It didn't make me happy. It just made me a really, really good liar. I clenched my fists in my lap, something inside me unraveling. You don't have to say anything, Ray said gently. I just want you to know that you're not alone. And whatever you think is going to happen if you stop pretending, he let out a breath. It's not as bad as you think. I looked down, blinking rapidly. My chest felt like it was caving in, but for the first time, I wasn't sure if it was from fear or relief. Ray stood up, patting my shoulder lightly as he moved toward the door. Just think about it. I stayed silent, staring at my hands. Before he left, he turned back one last time. And if you ever need to talk, I'm here. The door clicked shut behind him, leaving me alone. But somehow, for the first time in years, I didn't feel so alone anymore. As the night deepened, the house was wrapped in an eerie silence, broken only by the occasional creak of the old wooden floorboards. I sat on my bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind a whirlwind of emotions. My uncle had always been a figure of quiet authority in my life, stern but kind, reserved yet observant. But tonight, something felt different. The conversation we had earlier lingered in my mind, his words carefully chosen, his eyes carrying an unspoken weight. Then came a knock, a soft, hesitant rap against my bedroom door. Hey, you still up? His voice carried through the wood, steady yet cautious. I swallowed, my heart suddenly hammering. Yeah, come in. The door opened, and he stepped inside, his face partially illuminated by the dim glow of my bedside lamp. He hesitated for a moment, then took a seat on the chair near my desk, rubbing his palms together as if trying to find the right words. You seemed distant earlier, he finally said, his voice measured. Something on your mind? I hesitated. Did I want to open up? Would he understand? A war waged inside me, fear of judgment battling the need to be heard. The weight of secrecy had pressed on me for so long that my own truth felt like a burden too heavy to bear alone. Uncle, I started, my voice barely above a whisper. Have you ever felt like you didn't fit the expectations placed on you? He didn't answer right away. Instead, he leaned back, exhaling slowly as if the question had transported him somewhere else to another time. More than you know, he said at last. His words lingered between us, heavy with meaning. I looked at him then, really looked at him. The way his fingers tapped lightly against his knee, the way his gaze softened yet remained unreadable. For the first time, I saw not just my uncle, but a man with his own struggles, his own history of battles fought in silence. You don't have to say anything if you're not ready, he said gently. But if you ever need someone to listen, I'm here. Emotions swelled in my chest, a knot tightening in my throat. I had spent so much time convincing myself that no one would understand, that I was alone in my thoughts. But here he was, offering a space where silence didn't feel like suffocation, but rather an invitation, an open door. And at that moment, I knew this night would change everything. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was heavy, but not in a way that crushed me. Instead, it felt like standing on the edge of something unknown, unsure whether stepping forward would mean falling or finally flying. My uncle gave me a small nod, as if sensing the storm inside me. "No pressure," he said, his voice quiet but steady. "Sometimes, just knowing you're not alone is enough." I exhaled, the tightness in my chest loosening just a little. "It's just hard," I admitted, my fingers tracing invisible patterns on the blanket draped over my lap. "I feel like if I say it out loud, it becomes real. And if it's real, everything changes." He studied me for a moment before leaning forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Maybe," he said carefully, "but maybe that change isn't a bad thing." I want to believe that. I really did. A part of me still feared the weight of my truth, how it might shift the way my family saw me, how it might change the way I saw myself. But another part, a quieter voice buried beneath years of doubt, whispered something else. Maybe the truth wouldn't break me. Maybe it would set me free. "Does it get easier?" I asked, finally meeting his gaze. A sad smile played at the corner of his lips. "Not always," he admitted, "but you learn to carry it differently. And along the way, you find people who make it feel lighter." His words settled deep in my chest. We sat there for a while, the dim light of the lamp casting soft shadows on the walls. Outside, the wind whispered through the trees, carrying the scent of damp earth and distant rain. Eventually, he stood, stretching slightly. "You don't have to figure everything out tonight," he said. "But just know, whatever happens, you're not in this alone." His words lingered long after he left the room. For the first time in a long while, I felt something shift inside me. The fear was still there, but it wasn't all-consuming. The doubts still existed, but they didn't drown out the possibility of hope. Maybe things wouldn't change overnight, but maybe, just maybe, they could change. And that was enough. I lay in bed long after my uncle had left, staring at the ceiling, my mind running in endless loops. His words echoed in my head, "You're not in this alone." For so long, I had believed otherwise. The fear of being seen, of being known in a way that I couldn't take back, had kept me trapped in silence. But now, for the first time, I wasn't sure if that silence was protecting me or suffocating me. I reached for my phone, my fingers hovering over the screen. I had spent months, years even, avoiding certain conversations, certain truths. But now, I found myself scrolling through my messages until I landed on one name, Daniel. We hadn't talked in weeks. Not since that night when he had asked me what I was so afraid of, and I hadn't known how to answer. Maybe I do now. Before I could overthink it, I tapped out a message. "Hey, can we talk?" I hesitated for only a second before pressing send. The screen dimmed as I placed the phone beside me. My heartbeat steady but strong. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if I was ready for the conversations ahead, for the truths I could no longer ignore. But as I lay there, listening to the rain beginning to patter against the window, I knew one thing for certain. This wasn't the end. It was just the beginning.